Welcome, and thank you for joining us on this relaxing journey back in time to one of the most fascinating eras of human history. Tonight, we will drift through the history of ancient Rome, a civilization known for its grandeur, its innovations, and yes, its incredibly bizarre punishments. In this video, we'll explore some of the most unusual, unsettling, and sometimes outright strange punishments that the Romans inflicted on those who broke their laws. From mock executions to being sewn into a sack with animals, ancient Rome's approach to justice was anything but ordinary. These were punishments meant not only to penalize, but to serve as lessons to society, ensuring that the people of Rome would remember the consequences of breaking their sacred laws. But tonight, we're not diving into just the harshness of Roman justice. We'll look at the philosophy behind these punishments and how they reflected the values, beliefs, and the power structure of the ancient empire. These stories will give us a glimpse into the fascinating and often dark side of Roman culture and law. Before we begin, take a moment to settle in and let your mind wander through history. If you're ready to relax, listen, and drift off to sleep, make sure to give this video a like. And feel free to leave a comment below. Tell us, what's the most bizarre punishment you can imagine from ancient history? Or if you've ever heard of anything stranger than what we're about to dive into. I love reading your thoughts, and who knows, maybe your comment will be the next one I explore. Also, I'd love to know, where are you listening from tonight, and what time is it where you are? It's always fascinating to hear where you're tuning in from around the world. Now let's journey through time, uncovering the most bizarre and unforgettable punishments from ancient Rome and beyond. Close your eyes, get comfortable, and let the past take you on a quiet, fascinating ride. Let's begin with a punishment so bizarre, so unimaginable, that it would send chills down anyone's spine. This punishment was not reserved for simple criminals, but for those who had betrayed the very ideals of Roman society. Those who had crossed a boundary so severe that the Roman Empire decided their fate in a manner that would ensure their name would be erased from history, in the most gruesome way. One of the most bizarre punishments from ancient Rome was the punishment known as the punaculi, the punishment of the sack. It was as horrific as it sounds, a punishment reserved for those who had committed the most heinous of crimes, most notably parricide, or the killing of a father. To the Romans, this act was one of the greatest moral crimes, an affront not just to the family, but to the very structure of Roman society. The Romans believed the family unit was sacred. Pater familias was the head of the household, a father who held immense power and influence over the lives of his children. To kill such a figure was to betray not only family, but the very foundation of Roman life. But what did this punishment of the sack entail? Well, imagine this. The condemned man, found guilty of killing his father, was stripped of his dignity, thrown into a large leather sack, along with an assortment of dangerous animals, dogs, snakes, or even a rooster. The sack would then be sewn shut, and the individual was cast into the river, where they would be left to drown. It's a punishment that sounds both absurd and horrific. The idea was to make the condemned person face a slow, torturous death, as they would be trapped in this confined space with the panic-inducing creatures, all while drowning, helpless to escape. For the Romans, it wasn't enough to simply kill someone who had committed such a grievous act. The punishment had to reflect the severity of the crime. But why such a bizarre form of punishment? Why go to such extremes? To the Romans, this punishment served more than just a practical role of administering justice. It was a lesson to the public, a reminder that such a crime could not go unpunished, and that the laws of Rome would come down heavily on those who dared to upset the natural order of society. The use of animals, particularly snakes, was not random. The Romans believed that the inclusion of these dangerous creatures symbolized the chaos and disorder that would come to the individual who dared to commit such an act. The discomfort and terror were meant to reflect the grave nature of the crime itself. This punishment wasn't just about ensuring that the criminal met their end. It was about creating a public spectacle. It would send a loud and clear message to the people of Rome about the consequences of betraying the family unit and breaking the sacred trust of paternal authority.
The Romans understood that maintaining social order required strong deterrence. And this method, however extreme, served as a powerful visual warning to anyone who might consider such a heinous crime. As we think about this punishment, imagine yourself back in Roman times standing on the banks of the Tiber River. watching a crowd gather, murmuring in horror and curiosity. The spectacle unfolds as the condemned man is forced into a sack with the animals that will accompany him in his final moments. The cries of the animals and the condemned prisoner would fill the air, creating a macabre reminder of the Roman commitment to upholding order and punishing even the smallest transgressions. This punishment wasn't without its criticisms. Of course, there were voices in Roman society that questioned the morality and cruelty of such a punishment. But even they couldn't deny its effectiveness in securing compliance with the law. It ensured that the condemned person would not be forgotten, that their fate would serve as a permanent reminder of the grave consequences of breaking the sacred bond between father and child. The punishment of the sack was just one example of how Roman justice could be both ingenious and terrifying. It was a perfect illustration of how the Romans viewed justice and it, just as a means to an end, but as a public spectacle designed to instill fear and reverence for the law. For the Romans, punishment was a necessary tool in maintaining order, but it was also an act of theater, an opportunity to remind the masses of the authority of the state. And so, as we reflect on this punishment, we might ask ourselves, what does it tell us about the Roman sense of justice? Was it a society that sought retribution and fear, or one that sought to ensure the moral fabric of its people remained intact? Was it an act of cruelty, or an act designed to preserve the core of Roman values: respect for authority, order, and the sanctity of the family? As we consider the brutality of this punishment, we also need to think about the cultural context. What makes a punishment like this so terrifying is not just its gruesome nature, but its very publicizes. The Romans made sure that everyone in the empire understood the consequences of wrongdoing. This was about more than simply meting out justice. It was about ensuring that every Roman citizen, from the highest noble to the lowest plebeian, understood the power of Roman law and its unyielding force. With that in mind, it's important to remember that such punishments weren't just random acts of cruelty, were part of a deeply ingrained belief system that placed a heavy emphasis on social order, public spectacle, and consequences for actions that went against Roman values. This first segment has introduced the bizarre punishment of the sack, providing a detailed exploration of the historical context, its implications, and its role in Roman society. As we move forward with the next segments, we'll uncover more strange and unsettling punishments from ancient Rome, continuing to dive deeper into the fascinating world of Roman justice and its cultural significance. As we continue our journey through the bizarre world of Roman punishments, we come to one of the most terrifying and gruesome forms of punishment known to history: being thrown to the beasts. This punishment was a form of public execution that brought together the twin forces of entertainment and brutality. In the heart of the Roman Empire, the arena was not just a place of gladiatorial combat, it was a stage for some of the most spectacular displays of power and control. Picture this: the sun beating down on the vast Colosseum, the crowds roaring in excitement, the scent of sweat, dust, and anticipation thick in the air. In the center of the arena, a criminal or a slave is about to face his fate, not just at the hands of a gladiator, but at the mercy of nature's most dangerous creatures. In ancient Rome, public execution was far more than just a means of meeting out justice. It was a performance. The emperor, along with the crowds, expected to be entertained. Death was not something to be mourned or solemnly observed. It was something to be watched, enjoyed, and remembered. And there was no spectacle quite like the spectacle of someone being thrown to the beasts. The beasts used in these executions ranged from the ferocious lions of Africa to the tigers, bears, and leopards that roamed the wilds of the empire's farthest reaches. These animals were captured from Africa, Asia, and beyond, and brought to Rome to perform in the grand spectacles that were a staple of Roman entertainment. When someone was condemned to be thrown to the beasts, they were not simply killed. They were subjected to a terrifying ordeal, a struggle for survival that the crowd would watch with bated breath. The condemned might be bound and thrown into the center of the arena, where the animals, hungry and wild, would attack. Sometimes, the victim was armed with only a sword, net, or trident, left to fight for their life against the beasts. And sometimes, even against trained gladiators in a deadly contest that was designed for nothing other than the entertainment of the people. The significance of these brutal spectacles cannot be overstated. For the Romans, these events were a public exercise in power and assertion of their dominance over the natural world and over those who had dared to challenge Roman authority. The beasts themselves symbolized the chaos and violence of the untamed world, while the gladiators and condemned criminals symbolized the order and control of the Roman Empire. But the act of throwing someone to the beasts wasn't reserved just for the criminals or slaves. It was also used to punish prisoners of war or to make an example out of those who dared to betray Rome. The fate of these individuals was a terrifying reminder of what happened when one went against the might of the Roman state. The Romans understood the power of spectacle. To throw a criminal to the beasts was not only to execute them, was to humiliate them in front of the entire population. The act would be a public display of power and domination, ensuring that the condemned person would be remembered not for their actions, but for the brutal way in which they died. Public executions were as much about sending a message as they were about delivering justice. This punishment, though harsh, was an essential part of the entertainment culture in Rome. The emperors and magistrates knew that to keep the people happy, they had to keep the games and spectacles coming. The idea of bread and circuses providing the people with food and entertainment to keep them satisfied and distracted was central to Roman politics. The more grandiose and spectacular the execution, the more it would please the masses. The beasts used in these executions were often trained for the specific purpose of tearing apart their prey. It was not just about a quick death. It was about suffering, fear, and slow torment. The condemned person would be subjected to the terrifying presence of wild animals before they even faced their inevitable fate. They would feel the pressure of the audience's eyes upon them, hearing the roar of the beasts and the cheers of the crowd as the drama unfolded before them. While this punishment was intended to terrify and entertain, it was also used as a form of public education. The Romans wanted their citizens to understand that crimes had consequences and that the state was always watching. The arena served as both a theater of violence and a court of law, where the ultimate penalty for wrongdoing was always an exhibition of the state's might. The crowds themselves played an active role in these executions. Their cries for blood, their cheers for the beasts, and their chants of approval or disapproval were integral to the experience. It was as if they were part of the judgments, their reactions shaping the final moments of the condemned person's life. In many ways, the fate of the criminal was tied to the will of the people. The crowd was satisfied with the spectacle. Then the punishment was deemed just. The execution of criminals by beasts was not merely a form of entertainment, was also deeply connected to Roman cultural beliefs about order and chaos, civilization and barbarism. The Romans prided themselves on their civilized way of life, their control over nature, and their ability to maintain order in a world that was often chaotic and unpredictable. The idea of the beasts represented the barbarian world, wild, untamed, and in constant conflict with the civilizing influence of Rome. By using wild animals in public executions, the Romans reinforced the divide between the civilized world of the empire and the chaos of the wild animal kingdom. To the Romans, it symbolized their control over both nature and society, showing the power of Roman law and order over the primal forces of the natural world. The use of beasts also had strong religious undertones. The Romans believed that the gods watched over the games and the execution of criminals. Jupiter, Mars, and other gods of war and justice were seen as active participants in these spectacles, lending their favor or disfavor to the events. Some executions were performed to honor the gods, asking for divine favor in return for the bloodshed offered as a sacrifice for the Romans. These animal executions were a form of ritual sacrifice. The condemned person was seen as a sacrifice to the Gaza-fitting end for those who had committed the most heinous of crimes. In some ways, the condemned was thought to be offering their life to the gods in exchange for the prosperity and safety of Rome. The use of the beasts was also a reminder of the ancient traditions that predated Rome. In earlier times, animal sacrifices had been common in the ancient world, and the Roman games continued this tradition in a more violent and public form. The public nature of these executions tied into the Roman worldview, which held that everything should be visible and transparent, even the punishment of crime, while the punishment of being thrown to the beasts was horrific in its own right. It was not an isolated phenomenon. Gladiators, too, became a part of the spectacle of Roman punishment. But, unlike the condemned criminals, gladiators were trained warriors, forced to fight for their survival. Their role in Roman society and their participation in the games elevated the spectacle into something more complex. Gladiators were seen not just as warriors, but as symbols of Roman virtue, strength, and resilience. However, there was a blurred line between the punishment of criminals and the spectacle of the gladiators. The death games were a form of punishment. For some, particularly those who were condemned to the arena as slaves or criminals. The public fighting of gladiators was not just entertainment, it was a brutal form of justice, where the ultimate punishment for a loser could be death. Gladiators had to fight against each other, but they could also find themselves fighting against wild animals, and sometimes our execution would come at the whim of the crowd. This brings us to the question, what makes a punishment just? In the Roman world, justice was often a form of public entertainment, designed to show power, control, and dominance over those who defied the Roman way. The combination of brutality, theater, and spectacle was what made punishments like being thrown to the beasts so effective. It was about making a statement and about showing that the laws of Rome were not to be taken lightly. The act of throwing someone to the beasts or condemning them to the arena was not simply about delivering justice. It was about sending a message to the public. It was a reminder that the Roman Empire was an empire of order, strength, and control. These punishments were extreme, but they were also effective in ensuring that the people of Rome understood the cost of betrayal, crime, and defiance. As we reflect on this gruesome punishment, it's worth considering how this view of justice has evolved over the centuries. While the spectacle of death has been replaced by more humane forms of punishment in many parts of the world, the echoes of Roman justice's emphasis on public spectacle, fear, and order continue to influence our understanding of justice today. As we continue our journey through the bizarre world of ancient Roman justice, we encounter one of the most brutal and psychologically devastating punishments ever devised by the Roman Empire: decimation. This form of punishment was reserved for the Roman military, and it was as terrifying as it was effective. It was a punishment that not only served as a lesson in discipline, but also acted as a tool for instilling a deep fear of disobedience. Among soldiers, decimation was one of the most severe forms of military discipline used by the Roman army, and it was designed to enforce obedience, loyalty, and fearlessness among the troops. The word decimation itself comes from the Latin word decimatio, which means removal of a tenth. In its simplest form, decimation was a punishment in which 1 out of every 10 soldiers in a unit would be executed for failing in their duties, particularly in the face of cowardice, mutiny, or failure during battle. But this was no simple execution. The process of decimation was a deeply psychological act, one that aimed to instill fear, obedience, and compliance. It was a public spectacle where the condemned were chosen by lot, ensuring that no one soldier could escape responsibility. The sheer horror of this process was meant to serve as a constant reminder that in the Roman army, loyalty, courage, and discipline were paramount. Let's now take a moment to imagine the scene in a Roman military camp. After a battle lost or a mutiny that threatened the army's cohesion, the soldiers stand in rows, fear and guilt hanging heavy in the air. The centurion approaches with a wooden tablet in hand, prepared to carry out the dreadful order of decimation. The selected soldiers are ordered to step forward, the deathly silence broken only by the marching steps of those walking toward their own fate. They are lined up and forced to face their peers, who will be called upon to witness this brutal reminder of the consequences of failure. The punishment was not just for those who had directly caused the failure, but for the whole unit, which would be punished collectively. Soldier who had done everything right, fought bravely, and remained loyal could find themselves in the unenviable position of being condemned, alongside their comrades purely because their unit had failed. The victims of decimation were typically chosen by lottery or random selection. The condemned soldiers were then executed in a variety of ways, from being beaten to death by their comrades with clubs, to being stabbed or struck by weapons. The soldiers who were selected to carry out the executions were often fellow comrades. A chilling act meant to deepen the fear and loyalty within the group. It was a process designed to tear at the very fabric of trust within the unit brothers in arms, now forced to kill each other under the watchful eye of their commanders. The psychological impact of decimation cannot be overstated. For soldiers who survived the punishment, the knowledge that they had participated in killing their comrades weighed heavily on their conscience. Even the soldiers who were spared the punishment lived with the terrifying possibility of being next. Decimation was not just about physical execution, it was about fear, obedience, and psychological trauma. But decimation was not just a method of punishment, it was a tool of control. It reminded the soldiers of the power the Roman state had over them, their lives, and their destiny. The fear of decimation kept the army in line, ensuring that soldiers remained loyal to their leaders and to their cause. Knowing that any failure could result in a punishment that was not just deadly, but soul-crushing. The concept of decimation had its origins in the early days of the Roman Republic. But it was during the height of the Roman Empire that the practice became well known. The use of decimation was first mentioned in the writings of the historian Livy, who recounts the punishment as being used in the 5th century BCE. However, it was during the reign of Julius Caesar and the early imperial period that decimation became a standard punishment for the army. One of the most infamous uses of decimation occurred during the Social War, 9188 BCE, when Roman soldiers were punished for their cowardice during a series of battles. The mutiny of certain legions was deemed so severe that decimation was ordered to restore discipline. In this case, the soldiers of the First Legion were made to face the wrath of this brutal punishment. A decimation like this was a public demonstration of Rome's commitment to maintaining order, even if it meant extreme measures. The threat of decimation loomed large over every soldier in the Roman army, and it became a powerful tool in the hands of the commanders. The Romans understood that maintaining a highly disciplined army was the key to their empire's dominance. To fail in the face of battle, or to show any hint of cowardice, was to threaten the very strength and unity of Rome. Decimation served as a harsh deterrent against mutiny, desertion, and cowardice, ensuring that every soldier knew the price of disobedience. While decimation was intended as a punishment for failure, it was also a statement that the Roman military machine would tolerate no weakness, no failure, and no disloyalty. The sight of soldiers choosing their comrades to execute, the blood of the condemned staining the arena, and the sounds of the executions echoing, through the camp were all designed to leave a lasting impression on the minds of Roman soldiers. This was the Roman way. There was no room for failure, no room for weakness. The psychological effects of decimation on the Roman soldiers were profound. For the soldiers who were chosen for execution, the experience was a harrowing one. Not only did they face death at the hands of their comrades, but they were also forced to confront the public humiliation of being singled out by their peers. There was a deep sense of shame and fear that came with being part of this brutal system. But for the survivors, the psychological toll was just as severe. To witness the deaths of their comrades, many of whom had fought alongside them in battles, was a reminder that no one was safe. The constant fear of decimation looming over their heads created an atmosphere of constant tension and unease. This fear permeated every aspect of Roman military life, keeping soldiers on edge and ever vigilant. The soldiers who survived decimation were often left with deep emotional scars. They had participated in an execution, killing men they had known and fought beside. These acts of violence were often performed under the orders of their commanders, leaving soldiers to wonder about their own morality and the cost of loyalty. The psychological burden of taking a life, especially that of a fellow soldier, was a trauma that could never truly be erased. In many ways, decimation became a method of psychological warfare within the Roman army. The soldiers who survived learned to become increasingly resilient to the brutal environment they found themselves in. The fear of decimation acted as a kind of mental conditioning, ensuring that soldiers would follow orders and remain disciplined, no matter the cost. While decimation remained a tool of Roman military discipline for several centuries, the practice eventually fell out of favor. By the time of the late Roman Empire, the use of decimation had become less frequent, and its effectiveness as a deterrent was beginning to wane. Some historians believe that the growing influence of Christianity in the Roman Empire, with its emphasis on forgiveness and mercy, played a role in the eventual decline of decimation. The rise of more humane methods of discipline and punishment also contributed to the move away from such extreme practices. However, the legacy of decimation lived on. It became a symbol of the extreme discipline required to maintain the power and order of the Roman Empire. The psychological effects of decimation remained etched in the minds of those who had lived through it. And its story has since become a powerful reminder of the Roman commitment to maintaining strict control over their army and their empire. The punishment of decimation is one of the most terrifying aspects of Roman military history, serving as a brutal reminder of the Roman Empire's commitment to discipline, order, and power. It was a punishment that left deep psychological scars on both the victims and the survivors, ensuring that every soldier knew the price of failure. As we reflect on this punishment, we can see how it encapsulates the dark side of the Roman worldview, where fear, obedience, and loyalty were paramount. While decimation may no longer be a part of military discipline, its legacy continues to serve as a cautionary tale about the lengths to which societies will go to maintain order and control. The Roman use of decimation reminds us that even the mightiest empires had to balance discipline with humanity, and that, in the quest for order, they were willing to sacrifice individuals for the sake of the collective. Among the many methods of execution devised by the Romans, none has captured the public imagination and struck fear into the hearts of people across the world quite like crucifixion. It's a form of execution that, while famously associated with Jesus Christ, was practiced extensively throughout the Roman Empire, an embodiment of the empire's power, its dominance, and unyielding control. Today, when we think of crucifixion, we often think of a single person nailed to a cross as a symbol of suffering, sacrifice, and divine intervention. But for the Romans, it was much more than a form of individual punishment. It was a public spectacle, designed not only to punish the condemned, but also to send a message to the masses about the consequences of defying Rome's law. To understand the true brutality of crucifixion, we must first step into the world of ancient Rome Imagine standing on the crowded streets of the capital, watching as a procession of condemned criminals makes its way toward the execution site. The air is thick with tension, the sunlight casting long shadows across the city as the condemned, often slaves, rebels, or those who had committed serious offenses, were led to their fate. But what exactly did this punishment entail? Crucifixion was not just about a death sentence, it was about public humiliation, prolonged suffering, and a slow, torturous death. The condemned person would first be stripped of their clothing and subjected to a flogging, a brutal beating with a whip, often laced with metal or bone to inflict maximum pain. This flogging was intended to weaken the individual, to bring them to the brink of death before the final execution. But it also served as a public demonstration of the consequences of breaking Roman law. Once the flogging was complete, the condemned person was often forced to carry the crossbeam of the cross, the patibulum, to the execution site. This was a humiliating act, walking through the streets while the crowd jeered and mocked, as if the person's entire identity was being stripped away in front of their very eyes. The cross itself was typically a large vertical stake, with the horizontal beam attached to it. The condemned would have their hands or wrists nailed to the crossbeam, while their feet were nailed or tied to the bottom of the vertical pole. The process of being nailed to the cross was incredibly painful and cruel through the wrists, not the hands, so that the person could support their weight on their arms. Nails would pierce the hands and feet, causing excruciating pain, while the individual's body was left hanging, struggling for air in the most agonizing manner. As the victim hung on the cross, the slow suffocation became the cause of death. The weight of the body caused the chest to collapse, making it difficult for the person to breathe. To breathe, the individual had to push up on the nails in their feet, causing intense pain, but at the same time, each attempt to breathe would bring them closer to exhaustion and death. The death was prolonged, often taking hours, sometimes even days, during which the person would suffer from blood loss, dehydration, and the shock of their wounds. This prolonged, excruciating suffering was meant to deter anyone who might be tempted to defy Roman authority. It was a punishment that lasted long enough to allow the person to suffer in front of the public, to be remembered not for their crime, but for the terrifying way they met their end. Crucifixion was not only a physical punishment, it was also a psychological weapon. It was a form of execution that humiliated the condemned in ways that no other punishment could. The individual's entire identity, their dignity, their honor, their humanity, was stripped away in front of the crowd. This was meant to dehumanize the criminal and send a clear message to the Roman citizens. This person had broken the law, and in doing so, they had forfeited their rights to any dignity. This humiliation was compounded by the public nature of the punishment. Crucifixion wasn't meant to be an isolated event, it was a spectacle for the whole city to witness. The execution was a show of power, and the crowds were encouraged to participate, either through jeering or even throwing stones at the condemned. The Roman Empire understood that fear was a powerful tool. Public executions, particularly crucifixions, were meant to instill terror in the people, reminding them of the consequences of disobedience. The psychological toll of crucifixion on the individual was immense. Not only did they suffer physical pain, but they were exposed to the public eye, forced to endure humiliation and taunting. The idea was to not only kill them, but to ensure that their death was remembered. The Romans believed that the memory of the condemned person as they hung on the cross would live on long after the person had died. The execution wasn't just about punishment, it was about making sure that everyone knew the fate of those who defied the empire. Crucifixion was reserved for specific crimes, those deemed worthy of the most extreme punishment. It was typically used for rebels, slaves, pirates, and criminals who had committed acts that were seen as particularly threatening to the Roman state. The execution of high-ranking political figures or Roman citizens was often carried out differently. But for the lower classes and outsiders, crucifixion was a way to make an example out of them. One of the most famous instances of crucifixion in Roman history was the execution of Jesus of Nazareth, a man who, according to Christian tradition, was sentenced to death by crucifixion for claiming to be the King of the Jews. His crucifixion would not only become a pivotal moment in the history of Christianity, but would also cement crucifixion as one of the most well-known and terrifying forms of execution. But the Romans used crucifixion long before the crucifixion of Jesus, and they continued to use it throughout the empire. In fact, one of the most significant revolts in Roman history, the Spartan revolt, led by the gladiator Spartacus, was met with thousands of crucifixions. After Spartacus and his army of rebels were defeated, 6,000 of his soldiers were crucified along the Appian Way, a road that led into Rome. The sight of the 6,000 crosses along the road was a stark reminder of what happened when you dared to defy Rome. Sound of a low, ominous hum, the whispers of ancient voices. The use of crucifixion in these contexts was a way for Rome to reassert its authority and remind its people of the power that lay in the hands of the emperor. Crucifixion was a clear demonstration of the severity of Roman law and the ultimate price one would pay for defying the empire, despite its effectiveness in instilling fear and maintaining order. Crucifixion eventually declined with the rise of Christianity in the Roman Empire. Under the reign of Constantine the Great, the Edict of Milan in 313 CE granted religious tolerance to Christians. And eventually, in 337 CE, Constantine himself converted to Christianity. As Christianity spread throughout the empire, the symbol of the cross began to take on a new meaning-long symbol of hope and sacrifice rather than a symbol of death and humiliation. The once feared punishment became associated with the teachings of Jesus, who had been crucified for his beliefs, and this shift in meaning eventually led to the decline of crucifixion as a form of execution in time. Crucifixion was abandoned as a method of execution by the Romans. The brutality of the punishment, combined with its association with the suffering of Christ, made it increasingly unacceptable to a growing Christian population. By the time of the Middle Ages, crucifixion was largely replaced by other methods of execution, such as hanging or beheading. The legacy of crucifixion remains a powerful symbol in both historical and religious contexts. It stands as a reminder of the lengths to which the Romans were willing to go to assert their dominance and control over their subjects. It also serves as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit as the act of crucifixion has become, through Christian tradition, symbol not only of suffering but of salvation and redemption. For the Romans, crucifixion was a punishment that humiliated and dehumanized its victims, a clear demonstration of their power over life and death. For the world, it became a symbol of sacrifice and ultimate love, as exemplified by the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. As we reflect on this punishment, it's important to remember that while it was an effective tool for maintaining order and control, it was also a reminder of the dark side of power and the cost of defying authority. It was a brutal form of justice, but it also left an indelible mark on history, shaping the way we view suffering, sacrifice, and redemption. Imagine being condemned to die not in a quiet, solitary space, but in front of a vast crowd, where the final moments of your life are not only a public execution, but a theatrical performance for the enjoyment of others. One of the most terrifying and public punishments in ancient Rome was damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts. It was a punishment so brutal, so humiliating, that it has lingered in the collective imagination as one of the most horrifying ways to meet one's end. This punishment was not reserved for just any crime. It was used for the most heinous offenders. And those who found themselves subject to it were often those who had committed crimes against the state, betrayed Roman authority, or even those who were accused of sacrilege or religious transgressions. The condemned would be thrown into the arena. The public spectacle of death where wild animals would tear them apart in front of a roaring crowd. This was not just about punishment. This was about sending a message about power, control, and the frightening reach of Roman law. But to fully understand the horror of damnatio ad bestias, we must delve deeper into the public nature of Roman executions. In the Roman world, executions were not private affairs. They were public spectacles designed to entertain the people, demonstrate the authority of the state, and serve as warnings to others who might be inclined to break the law. The arena was the heart of Roman public executions. The Romans loved their entertainment. Gladiatorial combat, animal hunts, and elaborate public executions were common features of Roman life. The arena was a place where the emperor, senators, and common citizens gathered to witness the punishment of criminals, the death of the condemned, and the ultimate display of Roman power. Damnatio ad bestias was often carried out in these arenas, where the condemned were thrown into the ring and forced to face the beast's lions, tigers, leopards, and other wild animals captured from the far reaches of the empire. These animals were not only the physical executioners, but also symbols of the chaos and violence of the untamed world. To be thrown to these beasts was not only to meet a brutal and painful death, but also to face an end that was completely out of the control of the victim. The psychological element of this punishment was staggering. The condemned individual was not only facing death, but was also subjected to the psychological torment of knowing that their last moments would be spent in terror, as the savage beasts tore into their flesh. It was a punishment that was as much about fear as it was about the finality of death. The spectacle of damnatio ad bestias was meant to do more than just execute a criminal. It was meant to demonstrate the overwhelming power of Rome. The roar of the crowd, the sight of the beasts tearing through flesh, and the fear in the eyes of the condemned served as a stark reminder of the price of defying Roman law. The process of being condemned to the beasts began with the trial. In many cases, the condemned were slaves, foreigners, or prisoners of war, those who had little standing in Roman society. They were accused of crimes such as murder, treason, sacrilege, or even religious offenses that threatened the stability of Roman power. Once convicted, the punishment was carried out with a high degree of public visibility. The condemned would be stripped of their clothing, humiliated in front of the crowd, and forced to enter the arena. The animals were often starved prior to the execution to ensure that they would be ravenous and eager to attack. The condemned person would then be released into the arena, often armed only with a weapon or defense like a spear, net, or trident, but it would be almost impossible to fend off a full-grown lion or tiger. If the individual was lucky, they might have a moment to attempt to defend themselves before the beasts overwhelmed them. If they were unlucky, they were torn apart immediately, their life cut short in the most brutal manner possible. The animals would usually be unleashed from cages that were placed around the arena. They were often trained for the spectacle, directed to attack the condemned by the handlers who were positioned around the arena. The crowds would cheer wildly as the beasts attacked, and the execution was often quickly decided. The individual was often completely overwhelmed by the strength and speed of the wild animals, and death would come from blood loss, shock, or asphyxiation as the beasts mauled them to death. The public nature of this punishment was what made it particularly effective as a deterrent. It wasn't just about killing the individual, it was about creating an event that the entire population could witness. Something that would keep them in line and remind them of the consequences of defying Roman authority. As with many other forms of Roman execution, damnatio ad bestias had deep roots in Roman culture and religion. The use of wild animals in public spectacles was not just a way to deal with criminals. It was a way to demonstrate Roman superiority over nature itself. The animals that were brought into the arena were often exotic, representing the far-reaching power of the Roman Empire. They came from regions that were far beyond the reach of ordinary Romans, such as Africa or Asia, and their presence was a reminder that Rome could control the farthest corners of the world. The act of releasing these animals to maul the condemned also had symbolic power. The beasts were seen as agents of chaos, as natural forces that could not be controlled. By using them in executions, Rome demonstrated its ability to conquer even the chaos of nature, imposing order and control on what was otherwise untamable. There were also religious undertones to these executions. In many instances, public executions involving animals were seen as offerings to the gods, a form of sacrifice to ensure that Rome remained in the favor of the divine. This was especially true in the case of gladiatorial games and animal hunts that were held in conjunction with religious festivals. The idea of killing in such a public and ritualized manner was not just about punishing the individual. It was about maintaining the favor of the gods. Damnatio ad bestias was one of the most psychologically torturous punishments ever devised. The condemned individual was not just facing death. They were facing a public spectacle in which their death was treated as entertainment. The constant fear of the beasts, the anticipation of their attack, and the humiliation of being forced to face an inevitable and slow death were all designed to break the spirit of the condemned. For the Romans, fear was an essential element in maintaining order. The theatrical nature of executions, especially those involving animals, played a significant role in ensuring that the public would remain obedient and respectful of the law. These spectacles were meant to leave a lasting impression on the spectators, a visual and visceral reminder that breaking Roman law had consequences. Even those who were spared the fate of being thrown to the beasts lived under the constant threat of such public executions. The presence of the arena as a place for punishment, torture, and public display created an atmosphere of fear and compliance. People knew that they could be brought to the arena at any time. Their fate determined by the whims of the rulers and the laws of Rome, like many other forms of Roman punishment. Damnatio ad bestias gradually declined with the fall of the Western Roman Empire and the rise of Christianity. With the spread of Christian values, the idea of public spectacle, humiliation, and torture as a means of punishment began to fall out of favor. The Christian influence brought about a shift in the way criminals were viewed, not as objects for public spectacle, but as individuals who deserved to be shown mercy. Even in death, as the centuries passed, the use of animals in public executions faded, and more humane methods of punishment began to replace the brutal practices of the past. However, the legacy of damnatio ad bestias, the idea that punishment should serve as a public spectacle designed to instill fear, lives on in modern criminal justice systems, albeit in less brutal forms. Damnatio ad bestias was one of the most terrifying and brutal punishments in the history of Rome. It was a punishment that not only resulted in death, but also served as a psychological public spectacle, designed to demonstrate the power and control of the Roman state. The victims were forced to confront their inevitable demise in the most terrifying way possible, with wild beasts representing the chaos of the natural world and the Roman state demonstrating its ability to impose order. While the punishment may have faded from use with the fall of Rome and the rise of Christianity, the legacy of damnatio ad bestias remains, a chilling reminder of the lengths to which societies can go in maintaining control and demonstrating power. As we continue our journey through the most bizarre punishments of ancient Rome, we come to a punishment so grotesque and humiliating that it would be almost unthinkable in modern society. This is the story of Ponacole, the punishment of the sack. To some, it might seem like a bizarre relic of a barbaric time. To the Romans, it was a cruel public reminder of the consequences of defying Roman law. Ponacole was reserved for a crime so grave that it threatened the very fabric of Roman society, parasite the act of killing one's father. The Roman family unit, and especially the relationship between a father and his children, was sacred. A crime like parricide was not merely a personal betrayal. It was seen as a direct attack on the social order itself. The punishment had to match the severity of the crime, and pana coeli was designed to deliver both death and humiliation in equal measure. But what exactly did this punishment entail? The condemned would not be simply executed in the traditional sense, like other criminals. Instead, they would be thrown into a sack along with various animals, usually dogs, snakes, and even a rooster, and then drowned. The sack was sewn shut, with the person inside forcing them into a state of extreme confinement and terror as they were sealed with wild animals. Their fate was sealed not only by the act of drowning, but also by the terrifying psychological torture that accompanied being trapped in a confined space with wild, panicked creatures. This punishment was far more than a method of execution. It was a theatrical act of justice meant to send a message to the people of Rome about the consequences of defying the sacred order of family life. To be condemned to pana coeli was not just to die, but to die in a manner so humiliating, so grotesque, that it would be remembered for generations. The process of pana coeli began with the trial of the condemned. Once someone was accused and found guilty of parricide, their fate was sealed. There was no mercy or reprieving the grotesque fate of being condemned to the sack. After the guilty verdict, the victim would be stripped of their clothing and humiliated in front of the public. The act of being placed in the sack was not just a physical confinement, it was a symbol of the loss of dignity. The sack was often made of leather, a material that symbolized both the strength of the empire and the degradation of the individual. The leather was tightly bound, ensuring that the condemned person could not escape or move within the bag. The psychological implications were profound, being trapped in such a confined space with no way out. No chance to fight back must have been an intensely humiliating and terrifying experience. Once in the sack, the condemned person was sealed in. And then the final act of the punishment took place. The sack, along with its captive, was thrown into a river, usually the Tiber River in Rome. The person would then drown while trapped inside, with the added terror of being surrounded by panicking animals. The wild creatures, dogs, snakes, and sometimes even a roost added a layer of psychological horror to the punishment. The condemned person, already facing death, would have been overwhelmed by the sheer terror of being lysed, surrounded by the creatures that were the agents of their demise. There was no dignity in this death. The public nature of the execution ensured that everyone in the empire knew the consequences of committing parricide. It was a statement not just to the individual, but to society as a whole. Roman law was inviolable, and anyone who broke it would face the most brutal and humiliating consequences. In ancient Rome, the family was the cornerstone of society. The paterfamilias, or the father of the household, held absolute power over his family, and his authority was sacred. The concept of paternal authority was central to the Roman understanding of order and structure. To kill one's father, to break the sacred bond of the Roman family, was seen as an act of cosmic and social disorder, direct challenge to the very fabric of Roman civilization. The Romans viewed the family as an extension of the state. To kill one's father was to challenge the authority of Rome itself. As a result, the punishment had to reflect the severity of the crime. The extreme nature of pana coeli was meant to emphasize the idea that family bonds and respect for the paterfamilias were central to Roman identity. It was a punishment that sought to restore balance to society by making an example of the criminal in the most public and humiliating way possible. This emphasis on public execution is not just about ensuring justice for the crime, it was about maintaining the social order. The spectacle of pana coeli served to remind the people of Rome that breaking the social contract had grave consequences. The visual impact of the punishment was designed to leave a lasting impression on the public. making sure that no one would forget the price of defying the authority of the paterfamilias and the Roman state. One of the most powerful aspects of Poenikelee was its psychological impact on both the condemned and the audience. For the condemned person, the mental torment began long before they entered the sack. The realization that they had committed the ultimate crime that they had. Killed their father would have been enough to leave the person in a state of despair. But the psychological torture didn't stop there, being forced into a leather sack, and having to face not only death, but also the terror of wild animals would have been a horrifying experience. Imagine being trapped in a confined space with no way of defending yourself, no ability to escape. The animals, in particular, were meant to symbolize the chaos and violence of the natural world. The condemned would have known that their end was coming, but the delay, the slow suffocation, and the terror of being overwhelmed by animals would have made the experience all the more agonizing. For the public, the psychological impact was equally profound. Public executions in ancient Rome were not just about punishing the criminal. They were about reinforcing Roman authority and maintaining social order. The crowds that gathered to witness these executions understood that the death of the condemned person was a reminder of the consequences of disobedience and disrespect for Roman law. It was a lesson in fear and obedience, and the spectacle of Poenikelee served as a moral warning to the people of Rome. Poenikelee had its origins in the early days of the Roman Republic, but it was formalized during the Roman Empire. Practice of punishing parricide with the sack was likely a response to the growing concerns over social order and the authority of the paterfamilias. In early Roman society, there were few other crimes as serious as parricide, and the punishment needed to reflect this. As the Roman Empire expanded and the juridical system became more sophisticated, punishment of Poenikelee became a way for the state to assert its control over its citizens. While many other forms of Roman punishment were designed to be quick and merciful, Poenikelee was designed to be public and agonizing. It was a reminder that the Roman Empire would not tolerate any challenge to its social structure. Like many brutal forms of punishment, Poenikelee eventually fell out of use in the later years of the Roman Empire, as the empire began to embrace Christian values. With their emphasis on forgiveness and mercy, there was growing resistance to such cruel forms of execution. The rise of Christianity brought about a shift in how crime and punishment were viewed, moving away from the public spectacle of brutal executions toward more humane and spiritually focused methods of justice. The abandonment of Poenikelee marked a shift in the Roman approach to justice, from one rooted in public spectacle and psychological terror to a system that sought to balance justice with mercy. This transition reflected the changing values of the empire as it evolved into a more Christianized society, though Poenikelee itself disappeared from use. Its legacy lives on in the cultural memory of Rome's legal system. The idea of justice as something to be publicly displayed and witnessed would influence later forms of execution and punishment throughout history. Even today, we can see the echoes of this method of punishment in the public nature of certain executions and the theatrical aspect of criminal justice in modern societies. Poenikelee serves as a chilling to would go to uphold social order. It was not just about punishing crime, it was about making a statement. The death of a parricide was not a private affair. It was a public spectacle meant to remind all citizens of the power of the state, the importance of family loyalty, and the consequences of betraying the very structure that held Roman society together. Poenikelee remains one of the most disturbing and psychologically complex punishments in the history of ancient Rome. Its combination of brutality, humiliation, and public display reflects the Roman Empire's belief in order at any cost. The punishment not only marked the condemned as outcasts, but also acted as a public warning to all who might consider defying Roman law. As we reflect on this punishment, we're reminded of the power of justice, the lengths to which societies will go to maintain order, and the human cost of maintaining control. Pona Calais is a reminder that the history of punishment is not just about the physical death of the condemned, but also about the psychological toll that such brutal methods take on both the victim and society. In the Roman Empire, one of the most devastating fates a person could face was not death, but complete obliteration from history. This was the fate of those who were subjected to damnatio memoria, or condemnation of memoria punishment. So extreme that it sought to erase the very existence of a person from the collective consciousness. It wasn't just about ending a life. It was about wiping away every trace of that person's legacy and ensuring that future generations would forget them entirely. Imagine this. You have lived a life that was full of achievement. You've gained power, respect, and wealth. But one moment of treachery, betrayal, or defiance of the emperor, and suddenly your name is struck from history. Statues of you are destroyed, coins bearing your face are melted down, and any mention of your existence is removed from public. Records your friends and family are forced to forget you, your contributions erased, your very name erased from the annals of Roman history. This was the devastating power of damnatio memoria. This punishment was not just a physical erasure, but a psychological one as well. The Romans understood that memory was power. If a person's name could be forgotten, then they could no longer inspire loyalty, fear, or reverence. They were gone, not just in body, but in soul erased from the cultural and political landscape of Rome. But why did the Romans develop such a brutal and psychologically cruel form of punishment? To understand this, we must look at the Roman concept of legacy, honor, and the role of memory in Roman society. In Roman society, memory was not just about recalling facts. It was about reputation and the immortality of the name. To the Romans, the idea of honor was central to one's identity, and reputation was everything. The name of a Roman family was considered sacred, and to have your name live on was a form of immortality. Generations of Romans would seek to preserve the memory of their ancestors, often dedicating monuments, statues, and inscriptions in honor of those who had gone before them. The concept of honor in Rome was intricately tied to how you were remembered by others. Roman men, particularly those of the senatorial class, were expected to build a legacy that would be remembered for generations. This could be achieved through public service, military conquest, and the philanthropic acts of the family. The idea was to create a name that would endure, a name that would inspire future generations to respect and follow the example set by those who came before. The opposite of this legacy was to be forgotten, to have your name and achievements erased. This is where damnatio memoria came into play. By erasing someone from memory, the Roman state would not just kill the person, they would also kill any possibility of their name living on. It was not enough to execute a person. For the Romans, erasing the memory was a punishment that was more fitting for those who had committed high treason, betrayal, or any act that had threatened the very structure of Roman authority. The process of damnatio memoria was a deliberate and highly public act. It was typically carried out after a person had been executed for a serious crime, especially for treason or betrayal of the emperor or state. The condemned person was not simply put to death, they were denied the dignity of an honorable death. The goal was to ensure that their legacy would be destroyed, so that they would be forgotten by both their peers and future generations. The first step in the process of damnatio memoria was often the destruction of statues. Statues were crucial to the Roman understanding of reputation. They were placed in public spaces and homes to honor important individuals, especially leaders. If an emperor or important public figure was condemned to damnatio memoria, the first step was to have their statues torn down or defaced. These statues were not simply destroyed, they were sometimes chiseled away, with faces erased or replaced. removing any trace of their physical likeness. Another form of erasure was the defacing of coins. Roman coins were often minted with the images of emperors or important figures. When an emperor or leader was subjected to damnatio memoria, any coins bearing their image would be melted down or replaced, ensuring that their image could no longer circulate in the Roman economy. In some cases, the historical records, such as inscriptions or documents, were altered or destroyed, to ensure that no record remained of the condemned individual's achievements or actions. The final step in this systematic obliteration was often the forbidden remembrance of the condemned person. Their name would be removed from the public record, and no one could speak of them. Family members of those condemned were often forced to deny any relationship to the individual, and the family name itself might be erased from history. This was an attempt to completely sever the connection between the condemned and their descendants. It was a punishment designed not only to end a life, but to ensure that the individual would never again have a place in the historical consciousness of Rome. While the concept of damnatio memoria might seem extreme, the practice made sense within the Roman context. The Roman state was built on the idea of order and respect for authority. Rome's survival depended on the loyalty of its citizens, especially its leaders and military figures. Any act of betrayal, particularly against the emperor or the state, was seen as an affront to the very foundation of Roman society. A traitor or usurper could destroy the fragile unity of the empire. If such an individual were allowed to die and be remembered, their name could inspire others to challenge the state or even lead to a rebellion. Therefore, erasing the memory of a traitor was seen as a necessary and strategic act. It was a way to make sure that the individual would never have the chance to resurface in the minds of the people. If their name could not be remembered, neither could their ideas. The most famous example of damnatio memoria was the execution of Emperor Nero. After his death in 68 CE, the Roman Senate issued a damnatio memoria against him, hoping to rid the empire of the memory of his tyranny and the disastrous reign that had seen immense persecution of Christians and political instability. Nero's statues were destroyed, his coins melted down, and even his name was erased from the public consciousness. It was a complete erasure, a powerful reminder that no one, not even an emperor, was beyond the reach of the Roman state's ability to erase them from history. The psychological impact of damnatio memoria on the condemned and their families was devastating. To be forgotten, to have no trace of your existence left behind in the world, was, in many ways, a fate worse than death. The act of erasing a person from history was meant to leave them as nothing more than a shadow, a fleeting presence that would never again be remembered. For the family members of the condemned, this meant that not only would their loved ones' name be wiped from existence, but they would also face the psychological burden of living with the shame of their association with the person. In many cases, the family might be forced into exile, their fortunes and status revoked, as they could no longer claim any connection to the condemned. For the public, the psychological impact was also profound. To witness the complete erasure of someone's memory reinforced the power of the state. It was a chilling reminder that the state could reach into every corner of an individual's life, removing them not only from reality, but from the cultural memory of Rome. It was an act of total control, a reminder that the Romans had the power not just to end a life, but to deny that life ever existed. As the Roman Empire began to weaken in the later centuries, damnatio memoria gradually fell out of use. The rise of Christianity and the empire brought with it a new focus on forgiveness and mercy. The idea of erasing someone from memory, rather than offering them the chance for redemption or salvation, came into conflict with Christian values. Despite this shift, damnatio memoria continued to influence the way rulers and empires used memory to control and erase the legacy of their enemies. The concept of historical erasure has echoed throughout history, seen in the destruction of statues or the rewriting of history to suit the needs of those in power. Damnatio memoria was one of the most psychologically cruel forms of punishment ever devised by the Romans. It was not just a death sentence, was a punishment of oblivion, an act that aimed to obliterate a person's entire existence, legacy, and memory. For the condemned, it was the ultimate erasure, and for the Roman state, it was a powerful tool to maintain control and order. This punishment was about more than just punishing a crime, was about sending a message to the public, showing them that the Roman state had the power to not only kill, but to wipe away the very memory of a person. It was a brutal reminder that loyalty and obedience were paramount in Rome, and that defying the state could lead to a fate worse than death. Imagine being condemned to die, not by a simple execution, but by a punishment so brutal, so visually horrifying, that it would remain etched in the minds of the Roman people for centuries. This is the punishment of the breaking wheel, also known as the Catherine wheel of punishment, designed not only to end a life, but to leave an indelible mark on history. In ancient Rome, where public spectacle was as important as justice, execution was often carried out in a way that made a statement. The breaking wheel was one such execution method, and it was both a physical and psychological tool meant to punish the condemned and intimidate anyone who dared defy the law. The breaking wheel wasn't just about death, it was about public humiliation, pain, and a slow demise. This execution method was designed to not only kill the condemned, but to disfigure them and leave a mark on their bodies. The method involved breaking the limbs of the criminal before they were tied to a large wheel, which was then mounted on a pole for the public to witness. It was, in every sense, a theatrical display of power, a visual representation of Roman authority, and a method of reinforcing the empire's commitment to discipline and order. But what exactly did the breaking wheel involve, and why was it used? In ancient Rome, to understand the terror behind this punishment, we must look at its origins, its methodology, and the psychological effects it had on both the condemned and the public. The origins of the breaking wheel can be traced back to ancient Rome, though it was not exclusively a Roman invention. The method of crucifixion and other brutal executions were common in Rome. But the breaking wheel represented a different kind of brutality, one that emphasized not just the finality of death, but the prolonged suffering of the victim. Initially, the breaking wheel was used as a method of execution for criminals, especially those who had committed particularly heinous crimes such as murder, treason, or sacrilege. But the public nature of the punishment, along with its terrifying visual impact, made it an ideal choice for those who needed to be made an example of. The spectacle of the breaking wheel not only involved the execution, but also the display of the body in a way that would leave the condemned person forever marked in the eyes of the public. As with many Roman punishments, the breaking wheel was not just a private affair, it was a public performance, meant to entertain, educate, and instill fear in the masses. This was part of the Roman philosophy of justice, where punishment was a way to reinforce the power of the state. And the spectacle was as much a part of the process as the death itself. The punishment of the breaking wheel was a two-stage process. First, the condemned individual was beaten, whipped, or even struck with a heavy mallet. The goal of this initial phase was to weaken the person's resilience, preparing them for the final and most gruesome phase of the execution. The condemned person's limbs, especially the arms and legs, would be shattered. The punishment was intended to break the bones so severely that the individual could not walk or move, rendering them completely immobile and helpless. This part of the punishment was not just about causing pain. It was about breaking the individual's spirit, making them completely dependent on the will of the executioners and the state. After the limbs were broken, the condemned was often placed on a wheel, a large wooden structure that would leave them vulnerable to the audience. In some versions of this punishment, the individual would be tied to the wheel, while in others, they might be strung up for display, ensuring that the public could see every aspect of their suffering. The wheel itself was mounted on a pole, elevated for maximum visibility. The condemned person would be displayed in front of the crowd, their broken body twisted and contorted, a living symbol of the punishment for rebellion, crime, and defiance. The wheels were not only a tool of execution, they were an example. The final step of the process was the death of the condemned person, which often came from blood loss, shock, or slow suffocation due to the position of their body. This combination of physical pain and psychological torment was designed to break both the body and the will of the individual, leaving them in a state of profound humiliation as their body hung on display for all to see. The psychological effect of the breaking wheel was immense. For the condemned individual, the horror of facing death in such a public and brutal way would have been overwhelming. The loss of dignity, the pain, and the humiliation were all designed to leave an indelible mark on the individual's mind. It wasn't just the threat of death that made the breaking wheel so terrifying, it was the knowledge that they would die, in a way that would leave their memory forever linked to a public spectacle. For the public, witnessing such an execution had its own psychological effects. The Romans understood that fear was a powerful tool in maintaining control. The breaking wheel was not just about killing a criminal, it was about demonstrating the power of the Roman state. The sight of a condemned person writhing on a wheel, their limbs shattered, their body broken and displayed, was a constant reminder that the Romans would tolerate no disobedience. The public nature of the punishment ensured that the lesson was learned. The spectacle of the breaking wheel had a way of ensuring that the condemned person was not just forgotten. They were imprinted on the collective memory of Rome. The painful, drawn-out nature of the punishment ensured that it would be remembered long after the condemned individual had died. The breaking wheel was not only a method of execution, it was a cultural symbol in Roman society. To the Romans, punishment was about more than death. It was about creating fear, maintaining order, and demonstrating the power of the state. The wheel became a symbol of Roman authority and a reminder of the consequences of defying Roman law. The public spectacle was also a reminder that crime would not be tolerated, and that the Romans would not hesitate to punish those who threatened the stability of the state. The breaking wheel was not just about ending a life, it was about imprinting the punishment on the minds of all those who witnessed it. This public form of punishment was a warning not only to those who broke the law, but to anyone who might consider rebellion against the empire. It was a way to ensure that no one would dare cross the line. The breaking wheel was a tool of fear, designed to keep the masses in check, to make them understand the price of disobedience. While the breaking wheel eventually faded as a method of execution, its legacy continues to influence the ways in which we understand the intersection of punishment, public spectacle, and psychological impact. Even today, the imagery of the wheel and its association with death remains powerful, though it is no longer used. The breaking wheel's symbolic power lives on in our modern understanding of the consequences of rebellion and the psychological toll that brutal methods of punishment can have on both the condemned and society. Today, the breaking wheel serves as a reminder of the lengths to which societies will go in maintaining control and order, as well as the human cost of such efforts. The breaking wheel was one of the most brutal, public, and humiliating forms of execution ever devised by the Romans. It wasn't just about punishing the condemned, it was about sending a message to the public, reinforcing the power of Roman authority, and ensuring that the memory of those who defied the law was forever linked to a public spectacle. It was a punishment that went beyond death, focusing on the physical, psychological, and cultural impact of the crime. In examining the breaking wheel, we gain a deeper understanding of the Roman approach to justice, one that was not just about death, but about maintaining order and control through fear, humiliation, and memory. When we think of gladiators, many of us picture the grand amphitheaters, the clashing swords, and the cheers of the crowd. These figures have been immortalized as symbols of strength, honor, and the brutal entertainment of ancient Rome. But while gladiatorial combat was certainly a form of entertainment and sport, it was also deeply intertwined with the Roman system of punishment. In the early days of the Roman Empire, gladiatorial combat was not merely a competition between trained warriors. It was often used as a form of capital punishment or humiliation for criminals, prisoners of war, and slaves. These individuals, often facing death or dishonor, would be forced to fight in the arena, sometimes against one another, sometimes against wild beasts, all for the amusement of the Roman public. While many people think of gladiators as volunteers or professional fighters, the reality is that a significant number of gladiators were condemned. Criminals or prisoners of war who were forced into combat to atone for their crimes or as a way to reinforce Roman dominance over conquered peoples. These individuals would fight not only to survive, but often to redeem their honor, knowing that the outcome of their battles would determine their fate, life, or death. But why was this form of punishment so popular in the Roman world? Why were criminals and prisoners forced into the arena, and how did this practice evolve from a form of punishment to a form of public entertainment? To understand this, we need to take a step back and examine the cultural and political significance of gladiatorial combat in ancient Rome, as well as the psychological impact on those who fought in the arena and the crowds who watched them. The tradition of gladiatorial combat in Rome is thought to have originated from funeral games of practice, where warriors or slaves were forced to fight in honor of a dead leader or noble. The idea was that the bloodshed would serve as a sacrifice to appease the gods and ensure a smooth transition into the afterlife. These games, initially held as private events for the elite, eventually evolved into public spectacles, growing larger and more extravagant over time. By the time of the Roman Republic and later the Roman Empire, gladiatorial combat had become a key element of Roman culture, deeply intertwined with the values of honor, strength, and fearlessness. For the Romans, the arena was not just a place for entertainment, it was a symbol of Roman might, a demonstration of the state's ability to control both life and death. Over time, gladiatorial games evolved into a political tool used by emperors and generals to gain popularity, secure loyalty, and maintain control over the masses. The Roman elite and emperors saw gladiatorial games as a way to keep the people entertained, bread and circuses, and distract them from political issues. But these games were also used as a means of punishment, particularly for those who had defied the state. Gladiators were often recruited from the lowest classes: slaves, criminals, and prisoners of war, individuals who had been captured or condemned by the state. For many of these individuals, being forced to fight in the arena was a way to meet their end. But it was also a final opportunity to prove their worth and redeem their lives. Some gladiators, particularly prisoners of war, had no choice but to fight, as they were given no other means of escape. However, gladiatorial combat wasn't just for the enslaved or defeated. At times, freemen, including criminals, were sentenced to the arena. They were forced to fight to atone for their crimes in front of the public. The idea was that these individuals, through combat, could demonstrate their strength, resilience, and courage, or they would die trying. The use of gladiatorial combat as a punishment for criminals was particularly popular during the reign of the emperors. When an individual committed a crime deemed serious enough to warrant death, they were often given a choice: face the gladiatorial arena or face the more traditional forms of execution, such as crucifixion, beheading, or being thrown to the beasts. 4. Those who were sentenced to the gladiatorial arena, the experience was not only physically brutal, but also psychologically torturous. These individuals were forced to fight not for honor, but for their lives. The condemned were put into a situation where survival was uncertain, and the emotional toll was immense. The fear of facing not only death, but also public humiliation in front of an audience added an extra layer of torment to the ordeal. The crowds in the arena, driven by the desire for entertainment, cheered for the survival of the most impressive fighters. But they also savored the death of the weaker individuals. For a condemned criminal, the idea that their execution would be watched and celebrated by thousands of people was a fate far more terrifying than a swift and solitary death. The arena was not just a place of death, it was a theater of life and death, where every battle was a dramatic performance. The gladiators who were forced into the arena were not only punished, but also became symbols of Roman culture. They were trained to fight, to be strong, and to survive in a brutal and unforgiving environment. These men, who had often been captured from conquered lands or condemned for crimes, were transformed into professional fighters, often with no hope of escaping the arena. The life of a gladiator was harsh. They were trained in special gladiatorial schools, known as ludi, where they were taught to use a variety of weapons and combat techniques. The daily regimen was brutal, with long hours of training, strict discipline, and little chance of respite. The gladiators had to fight not just for victory, but for their lives, knowing that their next fight could very well be their last. Yet, despite the grim circumstances, some gladiators became famous, even admired, for their skill and bravery in the arena. These celebrated fighters were often granted the title of prima, or the first among their peers, receiving fame and admiration from the public. While they may have initially been forced into the arena as punishment, some gladiators were able to turn their fame into a source of pride and respect. For the public, the gladiatorial games were an opportunity to witness the might and valor of the gladiators. The games became a symbol of the imperial authority, a reminder that the emperor had the power not only to rule over life and death, but also to control the very fate of those in the empire. The gladiators became tools of the state, their suffering and sacrifice serving to reinforce the authority of the emperor and to demonstrate the strength of Roman law. However, for the gladiators, there was no choice. Whether they fought for glory, survival, or as punishment, their fate was decided by those who held power over them. Some gladiators, particularly slaves and prisoners of war, were forced to fight as a form of retribution for their crimes or their status. They were punished, not with death alone, but with the ultimate form of public humiliation and violence. The psychological impact of gladiatorial combat on the condemned and the gladiators themselves was profound. For those condemned to fight, the knowledge that they were fighting for survival in front of an often hostile crowd must have been terrifying. Not only were they facing death in the arena, but they were also forced to confront their own mortality in a setting where failure meant public death. For the gladiators, the fear was no less. They were trained to fight with ferocity and bravery, but the knowledge that they could die at any moment was a constant source of stress and anxiety. Even the most celebrated gladiators were not immune to the mental toll of their role in the arena. The idea that they were fighting not only for survival, but also for the entertainment of the Roman masses created a sense of dehumanization. They were no longer seen as individuals, but as objects of spectacle, their lives disposable, their fates tied to the whims of the emperor and the crowds. As the Roman Empire transitioned toward Christianity and began to embrace more humane practices, gladiatorial combat began to lose its role as a form of punishment. The rise of Christianity, with its emphasis on mercy and forgiveness, clashed with the brutal nature of the gladiatorial games. The idea of fighting to the death for entertainment gradually fell out of favor, particularly with the increasing influence of Christian values, which saw such spectacles as cruel and barbaric. Despite this shift, the gladiatorial games continued for centuries. It wasn't until the 5th century CE, during the reign of the Eastern Roman Emperor Honorius, that gladiatorial combat was officially abolished. The end of the gladiatorial games marked a shift in Roman cultural values as the empire began to turn toward more spiritual and moral ideals. The use of gladiatorial combat as a form of punishment is one of the most fascinating and gruesome aspects of ancient Roman justice. It was a punishment that combined physical suffering, psychological trauma, and public spectacle. Gladiators were more than just fighters. They were symbols of power, tools of control, and victims of the state's brutal system of punishment. As we reflect on this form of punishment, it is essential to consider how it shaped the Roman view of justice and authority. Gladiatorial combat was not just about death, it was about control, about reminding the public of the consequences of rebellion, crime, and disobedience. It was a punishment designed to leave a mark on both the individual and the society, though gladiatorial combat is no longer practiced today. Its legacy continues to influence our understanding of punishment, entertainment, and the intersection of violence and spectacle in human history. Among the many punishments handed down by the Roman state, exile stands out as one of the most psychologically devastating yet culturally significant forms of punishment. Exile was not about the loss of life, but the loss of everything else. One's identity, family ties, and connection to society were all severed in one fell swoop. Exile was a punishment that removed an individual from the life they knew, forcing them to live in isolation, often far from the empire's heart. It was used to punish those who were politically dangerous, who had challenged the Roman state, or who were deemed to be a threat to Roman order. The very act of banishment carried with it a deep sense of humiliation, and for many, it was a fate worse than death. Unlike other forms of punishment, exile had a profound psychological impact. To be exiled was to be forgotten, rejected, and isolated from everything one held dear. While some criminals were executed or imprisoned, exiles were often sent to remote corners of the empire, where they were forced to live in solitude and poverty, stripped of their social status and their former lives. But why did the Romans use exile as a form of punishment? What made it such a powerful tool in maintaining Roman authority, and how did it affect those who were forced into it? To understand this, we need to explore the history and the social implications of exile, as well as the psychological toll it had on both the exiled individuals and Roman society. Exile, or exilium, was not a punishment unique to Rome. It had been practiced in various forms by ancient civilizations, including the Greeks and Egyptians. However, the Romans took the concept of exile and formalized it as part of their legal system. In Roman law, exile was seen as a way of removing a threat to the stability of the state without resorting to execution. It was a lesser penalty in that it allowed the individual to continue living, but it also served to show that the Roman state had the power to dispossess them of their life, everything that gave them meaning and identity. Exile was often imposed for crimes such as treason, rebellion, sacrilege, or political conspiracy. If an individual was perceived as a threat to the emperor or the empire, they could be condemned to exile, where they would live far from the centers of Roman power. Exile was not just a physical banishment, it was a symbolic severance from the very essence of Roman identity. The Roman historian Tacitus recounts the use of exile during the reign of Emperor Tiberius. Tiberius, known for his paranoia and fear of rivals, would exile anyone who he perceived as a threat to his rule. Whether it was through a political rivalry or accusations of conspiracy, those exiled were often left to wither away in foreign lands. Far from the reach of Roman society and its bustling cities, the process of exile typically began with a formal accusation. The individual accused of treason or subversive activity would be brought to trial in a Roman court, where they would face charges that often had more to do with political motives than actual criminal acts. If convicted, the penalty would not necessarily be death, but rather the more insidious punishment of exile. The condemned person would be stripped of their citizenship, deeply humiliating act for a Roman. This loss of citizenship was not merely symbolic, it meant that the individual was removed from Roman society, no longer able to hold property, make contracts, or participate in public life. It was the ultimate rejection of a person's status, as Roman citizenship was one of the most coveted positions in the ancient world. Once the verdict was handed down, the individual would be forced to leave the empire's heart, Rome itself, and travel to a remote, often barren part of the empire. The conditions of exile were harsh. Individuals were sent to provinces like Sardinia, Illyricum, or the far reaches of Gaul. These were regions far from the comforts and privileges of Roman life, where the exiled individual would be forced to live in poverty, discomfort, and solitude. While some exiles could live relatively comfortably if they had wealth or family connections, most were sent to harsh environments where survival was a daily struggle. Exile was a punishment that isolated the condemned person from everything they had known: family, status, and, most importantly, their identity as a Roman. Exile in ancient Rome wasn't just about being sent to a remote location, it was about being cut off from everything that gave one's life meaning. For Romans, honor and reputation were central to their identity. To be exiled was not only a punishment for criminal activity, it was a punishment that erased the individual from the historical memory of Rome. To be forgotten was perhaps the worst fate a Roman could face. For the exiled individual, the punishment was far from over once they reached their destination. The mental toll of exile was immense. It was not just about physical separation, it was about the psychological separation from Roman life. The individual was forced to live in a place where they were seen as a stranger, an outsider. Well, they could no longer walk the streets of Rome, no longer be part of the cultural and political world that they had once known. They were isolated, forgotten, and cut off from the very essence of what made them Roman, even for those exiled for less serious crimes. The social stigma of exile could follow them for the rest of their lives. Publicly rejected, the exiled were often viewed with scorn by other Romans who saw them as traitors or failures. The shame of exile was a constant burden, a reminder that the individual had failed to uphold the ideals of Roman society. The loss of dignity was perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of exile. Exiled individuals were often forced to live in poverty and obscurity, away from their family and their past life. For those who were politicians, military leaders, or noble figures, this loss of power and status was often the most bitter aspect of their punishment. Many exiles spent the rest of their lives trying to maintain a semblance of dignity despite their exile, often in vain. Exile also played an important role in Roman politics. The Senate, emperors, and generals used exile as a tool to eliminate political rivals, those who posed a threat to their authority or their plans for the empire. It was a way of neutralizing opponents without resorting to more violent methods. A rival might be accused of treason, conspiracy, or even disrespecting the emperor, and in response, the individual would be sent into exile. One famous example of exile in Roman history was the case of the general Pompey the Great. After Pompey's defeat by Julius Caesar during the civil wars, he fled to Egypt. However, after Pompey's arrival, he was betrayed and killed. His fate, though tragic, was far less permanent than exile would have been. Had he been exiled, Pompey's name would have lived on in a different way. He would have been remembered not as a betrayed leader, but as a man who had been removed from the pages of history, living out his final days in humiliation. While exile could sometimes be a temporary sentence, for many, it was a life sentence. Once banished, the individual could never return to the empire, and the prospects of return were rare. In some cases, the exiled person might appeal to the emperor or the Senate for pardon, but these appeals were often unsuccessful unless the individual had significant connections or wealth. for those exiled individuals who spent their final years in solitude. The experience was often a bitter one. The exiled were separated from family, from friends, and from the Roman way of life. Some lived out their final days in relative obscurity, while others continued to hope for a return to Rome. However, very few exiles were ever allowed back, and many died in exile, their names erased from the historical record. As the Roman Empire began to decline, exile became less common as a punishment. By the time of the Byzantine Empire, the practice of exile had lost much of its significance. Christianity's rise also introduced new values such as mercy, forgiveness, and redemption, which conflicted with the harshness of exile. Instead of exile, criminals and political enemies were often subjected to more humane forms of punishment, such as imprisonment or even exile within the empire to less distant locations. Despite this shift, exile continued to be used in various forms during the later periods of the Roman Empire. The emperor's power remained significant, and exile was still seen as a way to remove dangerous individuals from the political landscape without resorting to the bloodshed of execution. The punishment of exile is one of the most profound and psychologically devastating methods of punishment in Roman history. Unlike death, which could offer a quick end to suffering, exile separated the condemned person from everything they had ever known. It was a form of punishment that isolated the individual, stripping them of their identity, status, and place in society. For many, exile was a fate far worse than death, a slow and lingering punishment that left them without any hope of redemption or return. Exile speaks to the Roman belief in the importance of honor, reputation, and status elements that defined a person's worth in Roman society. To be exiled was to lose everything: family, friends, and a connection to the Roman way of life. It was a punishment that isolated its victims, leaving them in a void of loneliness and obscurity. As we reflect on the history of exile in ancient Rome, we are reminded of the lengths to which the Roman state would go to maintain its power and control. Exile was a tool of the elite, used to remove those who threatened the status quo. In the history of ancient Rome, there were many forms of punishment, but few were as brutal as inhumane, and as relentless as damnatio ad metalla, the condemnation to the mines. While many people associate Roman punishment with gladiatorial combat, public executions, or torture, damnatio ad metalla represented a fate even more sinister than death. This punishment involved condemning individuals to work in the grueling and dangerous mines of the empire, where survival was anything but guaranteed. The condemned were forced to live in conditions of extreme poverty, hard labor, and constant physical suffering, whether they were criminals, slaves, or prisoners of war. Those condemned to the mines were stripped of their humanity, dignity, and hope. The very essence of their existence was reduced to labor, and many of them never emerged from the darkness of the mines alive. But why did the Romans use such a punishment? What made damnatio ad metalla a method of choice for the most unforgivable crimes? And why did it persist for so long in Roman history? To answer this, we need to dive deep into the grueling conditions of the mines, the history of this punishment, and the psychological toll it took on its victims. The punishment of damnatio ad metalla has its roots in the early days of the Roman Republic and was expanded during the height of the Roman Empire. Initially, the Roman legal system imposed harsh penalties for serious offenses, including treason, rebellion, theft, and other crimes. Slaves and prisoners of war were often considered expendable, and the state found it useful to exploit their labor for the benefit of the empire. Mining had always been a critical part of the Roman economy. The empire's vast territory was rich in natural resources, and the mines provided valuable minerals such as gold, silver, iron, and copper, all of which were essential to the economy and military expansion. However, working in the mines was a grueling, dangerous, and often life-threatening task. The Roman state began to utilize this labor as punishment for those who had committed crimes against the state or who were considered dangerous to its authority. Condemning someone to the mines was seen as a death sentence, but one that allowed the Roman state to extract labor from the condemned, using their suffering as a tool of both punishment and productivity. Those sentenced to the mines had no chance of redemption. Their punishment was not about justice or rehabilitation, but about using their bodies as tools for the empire's gain. Life in the mines was harrowing. The condemned were sent to remote mining camps, often located in far-flung corners of the empire, far from the comforts and safety of Roman society. These mines were typically situated in mountainous regions where the terrain was harsh and the conditions were even more severe. Once they arrived at the mines, the condemned were forced to work in extreme conditions, sometimes day and night, in tunnels that were cramped, dark, and filled with dangerous fumes and dust. The mining process was primitive and brutal. Laborers used simple tools such as pickaxes and hammers to extract minerals from the earth. The work itself was not only physically demanding, but also incredibly dangerous. Miners were at constant risk of collapsing tunnels, poisonous fumes, and the constant threat of injury or death. The mines were often flooded, and those who worked there were vulnerable to drowning, as well as to the dangers of the heavy machinery and tools that were used in mining operations. The condemned were also bound in chains, which meant that they could not escape or rebel against the harsh conditions. Even when they were not actively working, they were often forced to remain in their chains while being guarded by Roman soldiers. The prisoners were given very little to eat and drink, and their rations were often insufficient to maintain their strength for the labor required. Disease was rampant in the overcrowded conditions, and death was an ever-present companion. The psychological effects of damnatio ad metalla were profound. For many condemned individuals, being sent to the mines was a fate worse than death. Isolation, degradation, and constant fear of death wore down even the strongest of minds. Imagine being stripped of your identity, shackled in chains, and forced to work in complete darkness for hours on end. The sense of powerlessness and hopelessness that would have permeated the lives of those sent to the mines was overwhelming. They were removed from their homes, their families, and their lives, and placed in an environment where survival was uncertain and death was inevitable. For those who were condemned for political reasons, the punishment took on an additional layer of humiliation. These individuals, often rebels or rivals to the state, were not only sentenced to labor, but were also stripped of their dignity and placed in an environment where they were forgotten by society. The idea that they could be sent to a life of invisibility and suffering was a punishment that often led to mental collapse. Many condemned individuals probably lost all sense of identity during their time in the mines, reduced to little more than tools of labor for the empire. The effect of damnatio ad metalla on families was equally devastating. Those who were sent to the mines were often separated from their loved ones, leaving them to live in misery and uncertainty. For families of those who had been condemned, the shame of exile to the mines was a life sentence in itself. The family would often be cut off from the individual, with no opportunity to intervene or plead for their return. Damnatio ad metalla was more than just a punishment. It was a tool of control used by the Roman state. The Roman elite used the power of the mines not only to punish criminals and enemies, but to maintain order in a vast empire. Those sent to the mines were exiled from society, cut off from the very social fabric that held the Roman world together. By stripping them of their status, dignity, and family connections, the Romans ensured that these individuals would be forgotten, their punishment lingering only in the whispers of the oppressed. Roman society was built on a foundation of order, respect, and loyalty to the emperor. The mines, as a place of punishment, reflected the empire's commitment to maintaining this order. By sending criminals and enemies to the mines, the Roman state made a public statement. It would not tolerate disobedience, rebellion, or threats to its power. The message was clear. The empire could not only destroy a person's body, but could also erase their existence from the world they once knew. But it wasn't just criminals who faced this fate. Prisoners of war, slaves, and conquered peoples were all subjected to this same brutal treatment. For the Roman state, it was a way to demonstrate its superiority over conquered peoples. Those who had been defeated were now reduced to tools of labor. Their once proud identities shattered in the dark, unforgiving depths of the mines. While it is difficult to pinpoint specific examples of individuals who were condemned to the mines due to the nature of the punishment, we do know that some high-profile figures and rebels were subjected to this brutal fate. One such example was Spartacus, the leader of the famous slave rebellion in 73 to 71 BCE. While we do not know the exact fates of many of the rebels who fought with Spartacus, it is likely that many were sentenced to work in the mines after their defeat. These prisoners would have faced the same grueling labor and isolation that others experienced in the mines. Another infamous example comes from the reign of Emperor Nero, who used damnatio ad metalla to punish those who opposed him. Some political rivals and potential usurpers were sent to the mines, their names erased from history and their fates sealed in the dark. Dangerous world of forced labor. Damnatio ad metalla gradually declined as the Roman Empire began to fall into disarray. As the empire weakened and its economy became more dependent on free labor and slave labor, the need for forced labor in the mines decreased. The Roman Empire shifted toward other forms of punishment, and the brutal practice of sentencing people to the mines became less common as the empire fell into decline. With the rise of Christianity and the growing emphasis on forgiveness and mercy, the harsh punishments of the past began to fall out of favor. The idea that punishment should be a means of rehabilitation and moral improvement replaced the older, more brutal forms of justice. However, the legacy of damnatio ad metalla remains a chilling reminder of how power can shape the fate of individuals, and the lengths to which an empire will go to ensure that its authority is upheld. The punishment of damnatio ad metalla was one of the most brutal, inhumane, and psychologically devastating forms of punishment in Roman history. It wasn't just a punishment for crime. It was a punishment for rebellion, defiance, and the threat of losing control. The punishment isolated the condemned, stripping them of their humanity and dignity as they were forced to labor in the dangerous depths of the Roman mines. This punishment serves as a reminder of the harshness and callousness of empire, where exploitation was commonplace, and where a person's worth was often reduced to their ability to serve the needs of the state. In the dark, unforgiving world of the mines, there was little chance for redemption or survival. As we reflect on the history of damnatio ad metalla, we understand that it was more than just a punishment. It was a tool for maintaining the dominance and control of the Roman Empire. The legacy of this punishment, though no longer practiced today, remains a powerful reminder of the extremes to which empires will go to maintain their power. As we reach the final chapter in our journey through the most bizarre and brutal punishments of ancient Rome, we come to one of the most horrific and spectacular forms of execution ever devised, the punishment of being thrown to the beasts. This form of punishment was not just an execution, it was a public spectacle, a ritualized display of Roman power, dominance, and control over both human life and the natural world. The condemned were not simply killed. They were made to fight for their survival, often against wild beasts in the Roman arena, the gladiatorial games, animal hunts, and other public spectacles were some of the most important cultural events in Rome, used by emperors to entertain the masses, demonstrate their own power, and reinforce the authority of the Roman state. But for the condemned, being thrown to the beasts was not just a death sentence. was a public humiliation, a cruel and violent form of execution that was designed to send a clear message about the consequences of defying Roman law. Imagine standing in the center of a vast arena surrounded by a roaring crowd, the hot sun beating down on your skin. You are stripped of all dignity and thrown into the pit with wild animals, knowing that your fate is sealed. The beast lions, tigers, leopards are hungry, wild, and unpredictable. There is no escape, no hope. You can only fight for survival, but you know that the odds are stacked against you. Your death is not meant to be quick, it's meant to be spectacular, violent, and publicly humiliating. But why did the Romans use such a gruesome punishment? What made being thrown to the beasts such a fitting form of execution in their eyes? And how did it serve their broader goals of social control, political intimidation, and entertainment? To understand this, we need to explore the history, rituals, and psychological impact of this punishment and its role in the public life of ancient Rome. The use of wild animals in executions dates back to the early Roman Empire, where animal hunts and displays were a common feature of public spectacles. These events were originally meant to honor the gods, particularly Venus and Jupiter, and were seen as a way to celebrate victory, military conquest, and the supremacy of Rome. Animals, especially ferocious beasts like lions and tigers, symbolize the chaos and violence of the natural world forces that could not be controlled. The idea was that, by controlling the beasts and forcing them into these spectacles, the Roman state was demonstrating its domination over even the wildest forces of nature. The public spectacle was a vital part of the Roman social and political landscape. The emperor and the elite would organize these games, not just for the entertainment of the people, but to demonstrate their power and their ability to control not only the lives of those condemned, but also the wild animals used in the spectacle. By throwing someone to the beasts, the emperor and his officials were not just executing a criminal. They were making a statement about the might of the Roman state. The spectacle of throwing someone to the beasts was often used for the most serious crimes, treason, rebellion, or sacrilege. It was also a way to punish slaves or prisoners of war. These individuals were disposable in the eyes of the Roman state. They had no rights, no status, and their lives could be used for public entertainment to remind the people of Rome of the consequences of disobedience. The beasts used in these spectacles were often exotic animals that had been captured from the farthest reaches of the empire. Lions, tigers, leopards, and bears were all brought into Rome to participate in these deadly games. The animals were often starved or weakened before the event to ensure that they would be aggressive and dangerous when they faced the condemned. It was not just about killing them quickly, it was about ensuring that the terror, the struggle, and the bloodshed would be visible to all. The process of being thrown to the beasts began with the trial and condemnation of the individual. Those accused of serious crimes or those who had challenged the authority of the Roman state would be sentenced to face the beasts. The punishment was often part of a grand spectacle in the Colosseum or other large arenas, where thousands of spectators gathered to watch the events. The condemned were often stripped of their clothing and humiliated in front of the crowd before being thrown into the arena. They would then be left to face the beasts, hungry, ferocious creatures that were released into the arena from specially designed cages. The condemned individual might be armed with a trident, net, or sword. But these weapons were often inadequate for dealing with the massive, savage animals that were unleashed upon them. The crowd would cheer, urging the animals to attack, while the condemned fought for their lives. In some cases, the condemned might be able to defend themselves, but the chances of surviving were slim. The beasts would tear into their flesh, and the fight would often end in bloodshed and violence. The spectacle could last for several minutes, depending on the strength of the animals and the resolve of the condemned. For the condemned, The experience was not just about facing death, it was about survival in the face of overwhelming odds. They were often forced to fight in front of a hostile crowd who would decide their fate. The outcome was uncertain, but the humiliation of being forced into combat with animals was as much a part of the punishment as the death itself. The condemned would be exposed to the crowd, and their struggle would be on display for all to witness. The most public of executions. Being thrown to the beasts was not just a punishment, it was a show, a performance for the masses. This spectacle was meant to entertain and remind the people of Rome of the power and control that the emperor and the state had over the lives of its subjects. The psychological toll on the condemned was immense. To face death in the arena, surrounded by wild animals, knowing that your fate was in the hands of the crowd, was a horrific fate. The individual would likely experience fear, panic, and terror as they were forced to confront their impending death in a public spectacle. For many, this form of execution was a form of absolute humiliation. Not only were they to die, but they were to die in the most spectacular and humiliating way possible. To be condemned to face the beasts was to be reduced to nothing more than fodder for the entertainment of the Roman people. For the spectators, the psychological impact was also profound. The Roman people, gathered in the Colosseum, would have witnessed death in a way that was almost ritualistic, a form of entertainment, where the ultimate penalty was meted out to those who had crossed the line. The act of watching someone be thrown to the beasts was not just about witnessing death, it was about experiencing the power of Rome. In its most primitive and raw form, the crowds were often encouraged to cheer for the death of the condemned, feeding into the mob mentality that thrived in these arenas. The more brutal the death, the more the crowd would cheer. In many ways, this was an opportunity for the masses to release their anger, fear, and frustration at the state, and the condemned became the ultimate symbol of Roman authority and the consequences of defying it as the Roman Empire entered its decline. The spectacle of being thrown to the beasts gradually fell out of favor. The rise of Christianity in the empire, along with the growing influence of more humane values, led to a decline in the popularity of these brutal public executions. As Christianity spread, there was a shift away from public violence as a form of entertainment and the gladiatorial games, along with the use of wild animals and executions, came to an end by the 5th century CE. The use of animals for executions and public spectacles was officially banned, and the Colosseum and other arenas began to lose their significance as places of death and entertainment. The Roman Empire itself began to crumble, and the brutal punishments that had been an integral part of Roman life were gradually replaced by more humane and religiously inspired practices. The punishment of being thrown to the beasts stands as one of the most brutal, humiliating, and psychologically devastating forms of execution in the history of Rome. It wasn't just about death, it was about public spectacle, control, and the absolute power that the Roman state wielded over its subjects. For the condemned, it was a fate worse than death, a form of execution that stripped them of their humanity and dignity, reducing them to little more than tools for the entertainment of the masses. As we reflect on the punishment of being thrown to the beasts, we are reminded of the brutality of the Roman Empire, but also of the psychological toll that such punishments took on both the condemned and the public. It was a form of domination, a reminder that the state could control not only the life of an individual, but also their legacy, their name, and even their memory. Thank you for joining me on this fascinating and dark journey through the bizarre and brutal punishments of ancient Rome. From gladiatorial combat to damnatio ad metalla, from the breaking wheel to exile. These forms of punishment show us the extremes to which the Roman state would go to maintain control and order. But as we've seen, the psychological toll on those condemned to these fates was profound in their stories. Even in death, are a powerful reminder of the price of defying authority. I'd love to hear your thoughts on today's video. Which punishment shocked you the most? Or do you have any additional questions about these ancient forms of justice? Let me know in the comment section below.